So welcome to session 3. So I'm going to be looking at the two very exciting discoveries that were made when I was in the States, and by different people at different times. These are accounts of people who encountered Adela Curtis. So this is seeing her through the eyes of others, rather than reading her published works, which were outward facing, what she wanted the public to see of New Thought and what she was doing. And it's different from her own diaries. This is her as she's perceived by others, and it's really fascinating to get these glimpses. So the first one is so Carl and Julia Vrooman, and they met Adela Curtis in 1912. So this building on this slide, this was their home in Bloomington, Illinois, and they're long dead. It's now a B&B. And because I knew that they were big supporters of Adela, I actually went and stayed in their house, which was quite fun. The town is not a tourist spot. It's not anywhere you'd be encouraged to go to. I mean, it's definitely seen better days. It's quite poignant when you look at old photos, as I saw, of this town, you know, back in the 30s or whenever, full of people. When I was there, hardly anyone sort of on the streets, and there was like one cafe. And Carl and Julia were a married couple. They didn't have children. They were a bit younger than Adela. They both lived to a great age. So Carl was 93 when he died, and Julia was 104. So she lived till 1981. And there's a lovely article in a local newspaper where she's celebrating her 100th birthday, and she's clearly still, you know, very much with it. And she mentions Adela Curtis when she's 100. So, you know, this was 20 years after Adela had died. But, you know, she was clearly someone who was very influential on them. So this is their house. This is the dining room where I had my breakfast every morning, and apparently this is the room where they entertained Eleanor Roosevelt when she came to stay once, because they were a wealthy couple who were politically well connected, both of them. That's another view around the outside with the porch, and it made me think of, well, most of you won't know Baddesley Clinton, but that kind of old house owned by the National Trust now that was sort of Victorianised. It reminded me of that. I felt quite at home, really, in this, but it's just a house in a street. It's not in its own grounds, you know. There are lots of houses, I guess, just like this in the street. This is the museum, which is a walk away from their house, and it's the McLean County Museum of History, and it has a library section, and they have a very good online presence. So I had seen before I went that they had got some Vrooman documents. I guess because Julia and Carl didn't have children, you know, they didn't have family to automatically keep their letters and things. So I knew that there might be things it was worth going and having a search in the library archives at the museum. And, you know, you don't know what you're going to find. It would have been disappointing if there hadn't been anything, but at least I would have known what there was or not. So it was on my, as often happens, it was on the final full day of my time in Bloomington, and there was a folder of Vrooman letters, and at the back of Julia's file was a folder named Miscellaneous, And in there were some scrappy bits of paper like this, crossed out and, you know, scribbled down. I didn't have time to read it properly, but I suddenly saw that she was writing about someone called Miss C here and meditating. Can you read that? I thought, she's writing about Miss Curtis. She must be. So I just didn't have the chance. It was 5 or 6 of these pieces of paper, many of them kind of crossed through like this. But Bill Kemp, who's the librarian there, he kindly scanned them for me so that I could look at them when I got home, which was brilliant. So I had that to look forward to. And interestingly, Bill was in touch with me only the beginning of the week about something to do with the Vrumans and something that they'd been given about them. And inside, it was a book written by Julia. And inside the book was happened to be one of Adela's pamphlets. So these tantalising bits of scrappy paper, and I thought, well, even if I'd asked someone to search those files for me, they wouldn't have picked out those scrappy bits of paper as being of interest. So I had to go, didn't I? So let me tell you a bit more about Carl and Julia. They were wealthy, they were well connected politically and socially in the States. The money mainly came from Julia's side of the family. Her father had bought up large plots of land in Illinois, in McLean County, and he turned them into successful farms. You understand, he didn't do the farming, he owned the land, other people turned them into farms, and he reaped the benefits, literally. It was corn farms. Flying over Illinois, you see it's just mile after mile after mile of these huge square plots, and it's corn. Julia's aunt was married to Adlai Stevenson I, so he was the vice president of the US in the 1890s, and he actually gave Julia away when she married Carl in 1896 because her father had already died. And Carl was from a very interesting family of progressive, reforming and radical politicians. His father and his 4 older brothers were all involved in politics to a greater or lesser extent. So his brother Walter established Ruskin College in Oxford, in this country, largely with his wife's money, to provide education for potential leaders of the working class in England. And all his older brothers were ordained as well, a really interesting mixture of seeing that faith and politics go hand in hand. Carl was never ordained, but he was a serious spiritual seeker. He really was looking for, what's life really about? What's my purpose in life? And he'd already drawn on new thought thinking and action before they met Adela. But she was the teacher who most impressed them, and they, from their first meeting in 1910, they developed a lifelong friendship. Politically, Carl would go on to be appointed Assistant Secretary of Agriculture under President Woodrow Wilson in August 1914, and he held this position for 5 years. So, he had quite a significant role in government during that period. And when the US entered the First World War in 1917, he was at the forefront of the push to encourage everyone to grow food in their yards and for farmers to diversify their crops so as to increase self-sufficiency in food. So you can see there is that link with Adela as well, this desire to be self-sufficient for everyone to produce food in their own backyard. But before World War I, when travel to Europe was still possible, they were to meet Adela. One of the other things that I found really helpful when I was in Bloomington in the library was someone had written a biography of Carl and drawn extensively on his journals. So it is possible to date key events, such as their first meeting with Adela. So one of their many trips to Europe in 1910 brought them to London in the autumn. And it was on this trip, so autumn 1910, Adela has just moved into Scarsdale Villas. So, this quite impressive looking centre in Kensington. And as we know, she had developed her own particular take on New Thought, and she'd already published The New Mysticism of Meditation and Health and the booklets, The Way of Silence. So she was a published author, of some renown in New Thought. And Carl captured his initial response to her in his journal, saying that Adela Curtis had got hold of a lot of new truth and has an effective method of teaching it. So, they were impressed by her. And indeed, when they returned to the States in the early 1911, Carl was hopeful that they had, in quotes, a splendid grasp of the practical side of New Thought and the anticipation that they doubtless can go from strength to strength now without any help from any practitioner. So I don't think they thought they'd be coming back anytime soon. I think they felt they'd got enough to be going on with. However, in June 1912, Julia Vrooman received a letter from Adela Curtis inviting them to join her for some weeks as she took holiday on the south coast of England in the summer. So she's based in London. I'm not quite sure where on the south coast, but obviously this place wouldn't have been it. And it was whilst she was on this holiday with Adela that Julia wrote what seems to be, some of it seems to be drafts of a letter. Sometimes she's kind of addressing someone, but we don't know who. And it's drafts. So, this is a particularly difficult one to decipher, as you can see. It feels as if, she wants to convey something really important, and it's difficult for her to get to the words. So, she's finding it difficult. Anyway, I've decided to start with the following extract because it's one of the more polished. It feels like it's not so much a draft. This is something that she's written sort of in neat, if you like. But there's no sort of opening, dear so-and-so. It just starts. So this is Julia talking about Adela and their experience of being on holiday with her in 1912. I wish I had any words to hint at what we are getting, at what she is opening up to us. But that is hopeless, so I will give you the barest details. We have been for the month of July with her and her secretary and one other couple, charming young people, in an adorable cottage on the English sea coast, as lovely and as isolated a spot as can be found in England. But the scenery, wonderful as it is, the moors purple with heather, and the downs aflame with gorse, and the white cliffs, the forests of fir, and the sea stretching across to America, the scenery is the least of the wonders. We both feel, Carl and I, as if this month were the red letter month in our lives to date. It marks a shining milestone on a shining way. This series of days spent in such close personal touch with Miss Curtis, whom before we have seen only at a distance, or for rare half hours snatched from her guard that had always stood guard over her like a stern sentinel and kept off intruders and interlopers. But what we had got from her classes and from occasional rare talks with her seemed to us almost the weightiest dividends that life had declared to us. So we set sail in June in order to come over for some more classes, some fresh inspiration to go on. And instead of what we expected, a repetition of last summer's programme with a meditation class 6 days in the week, and students packed in all the houses and inns about the countryside and going, some of us, 8 and 10 miles a day for that precious hour. Behold us here in this idyllic spot, part of the nicest little house party you can imagine with Miss C. The life of the company, throwing herself into every excursion with all the zest of a girl of 16, as eager and fresh and radiant a spirit, as captivating a personality as I have ever known. She has the mind of a philosopher, the soul of a seer, and the heart of a little child. What she gets out of life, and what she gets out in the way of joy and in inspiration, is beyond all words. Wow. It's amazing, isn't it? It's moving, actually, because this is 1912, so, and it's rare for anyone, it would seem, from what she's saying, you know, for anyone to get a glimpse of Adela up close and personal. There must have been something about them that struck her, someone who found relationships difficult, to invite them for a holiday, and knowing that they would be spending this time, you know, in a very different way with her. And how does she come across in this description? Girlish and full of zest and enjoying the holiday. It's lovely when you think back to, you know, what she contended with in her early life. And I guess perhaps this is part of the effect of the new thought that she's taken on, with it, you know, lifting the sort of burdens that I think she felt, sin and judgment and the burdens of the past. You know, perhaps she's able to lift that and enjoy life in this way. I'm also struck by how popular she was as a teacher. You know, the description that Julia was giving, and why would she say anything that wasn't her experience? You know, of people flocking for miles when Adela was teaching at the school. People would come for miles for that hour with her. We'll go on to another bit. And this second extract, it sounds like a letter that Julia is drafting. She's addressing someone. Well, she was in the other one, wasn't she? But this one is a more personal. We still don't know who it is that she's writing to. And she, that is Miss Curtis, is one of the people who has suffered and grown strong and glad. So then, my dear, it breaks my heart that so many days and months fly by with you still not coming to her to let her help you find what you are seeking, what you are starving for. And she can tell you, she has found the way and the truth and the life. Carl said to me last night, after she'd been talking to us for an hour as we sat around the fire, beginning on some trivial subjects, and suddenly, before we knew it, as a boat glides out of the shallow bay into the vast ocean, launching out on some great theme, Carl said, I have never heard any human speak in so inspired a way. I know of no message so full of life and virility. She, of all the speakers and teachers I have ever known, has caught the spirit of the words of Christ. After she'd gone upstairs, we sat quiet for a long time. One doesn't feel like stirring much after a talk like that. One wants to hold the feeling of the words. Then we fell to talking of the speaker, Miss C. This teacher, with all her girlish, winning ways, her different phases, her powers of swift transition from the deepest philosophy to the highest and gayest banter. There are no ugly gaps in her talks, no awkward pauses to catch one's breath before one descends with her from the Olympian heights to the discussion of some trivial detail of the day's programme, whether we will have jam or marmalade in our tea baskets for the picnic, and what route we will take. Then she falls to on the maps and is dead to the world. Some description from studying the map calls forth peals of laughter. I've rarely seen such a mixture of mirth and wisdom as goes on under our roof. I think the solitary old bachelor neighbour we have, whose grounds run down to ours, has long since given our party up. One minute he's absolutely and finally convinced, after spying us out with his sea glass and catching us at meditation in the garden, when some were sitting with Miss C meditating, that we are religious fanatics, people who have fled the world to seek solace in religion. 2 hours later, such peals and outbursts of hilarious laughter float over his garden wall that he thinks, and there are pages missing. Turning over, no! What does he think? It's fascinating, isn't it? They're clearly deeply inspired by her, and she's got an authority in her speaking and is saying things that they find really helpful. They are two of her followers, like almost all of the sisters who are named in the chapel. They're two of the followers who sort of managed the transition from her in this period to when she sort of changed the focus of her teaching quite radically when she moved here. And they kept on coming here and supporting her. And I believe they were great financial supporters of the chapel, along with others. So this third extract, the sort of the theme behind this, this is interesting to see what Adela feels her students should be doing in relation to what she's saying. So one night, this is Julia again, one night after she'd gone upstairs, while the spell of her words was still on me, I set down what she said. Sentence after sentence came back almost word for word. I was very pleased to think my memory had stood me in such good stead, but far more pleased to have had so true a record of her words. After that, I used to set down something of every night's talk, a veritable treasure trove it came to be. Then I had them typed into a little book, My Cheerful Treasure, which I showed her proudly a few months later. To my surprise, she looked a little annoyed. Is that all you have got? She demanded rather sternly. Will I have to spank my meaning into this child to make her get it? She appended to the others, half playfully, yet with the intention of making anybody catch her point this time. Here is Mrs. Vrooman making a good effort to preserve my words, setting them down as if they counted. It doesn't make one iota of difference about the words, the form. The feeling behind the words is the only thing that is worth keeping. And if you spend your time trying to record the words, fasten them in your memory, perform that undiluted feat, you miss my feeling behind my words, which you might have caught if you had listened with your heart for that alone. I think that's really interesting. It's not the words, it's not the what you capture on the page, it's what it's doing to you within, the feeling behind the words. It made me think of, we say today, don't just keep taking photos of something, actually be there in the experience rather than being behind the camera. It's a similar sort of thing. But yeah, she was rather annoyed to see this little booklet. I thought that was very interesting. And then there's one that sort of goes on, the pointlessness of imitating a teacher. To try to imitate a teacher or anyone else, to use his second-hand thought. I mean, she uses his, whether it's male or female, whether it's herself or not. To use his second-hand thought, his inspiration, when you can learn from your own principle first-hand, is absolutely contrary to this teaching. Your inspiring principle will work through you if you will trust it, use you, to give an original expression of truth, not in the form by which it teaches me to express it, but as it teaches you. There is no possibility of imitation, of duplication in this. Here is the answer to that question. Is anybody to be run into the same mould? No, two people could never ever be run in the same mould. Each develops according to the law of his own individual being. Each one learns to speak by inspiration, to live by inspiration, according as principle gives it to him to live and speak. Principle turns out no duplicates, no imitators but originals. If you imitate the teacher, want to become like him, to speak like him, or write like him, or imitate him in any way, or cling to his personality, or are carried away by the beauty of this form of teaching, you have missed the whole spirit of this teaching. This is the only teaching that does develop originals, that teaches people to stand alone. So if you remember, the idea is that you look within for the divine, for the principle, and according to this, you will become your own, your principle will inspire you to become the person, the teacher you are meant to be. I do wonder, though, whether, was it perhaps when people started doing this that Miss Curtis found it difficult? On the one hand, she was saying, don't imitate me, but then on the other, she found it very difficult when people didn't do things the way she did. I wonder whether it was a real dilemma for her. So just a final little extract. She would call out powers you never dreamed you had, and developing them as God meant you to would begin. And someday you would wake up with a little cry of joy to realise that you were proving in your own life the meaning of the words of Christ, that the kingdom of heaven was within you, and your body and mind and soul and spirit would all begin straight away to take on a new lease of life. Julia is longing for someone that she's very fond of to hear this teaching and to hear the good news, isn't she? And that, I guess this is what she feels that she's beginning to experience, that she is proving in her own life, that the kingdom of heaven is within her, and this sort of sense of new lease of life. So there we are. It's a fragmentary glance of Adela at this stage in her life, and I think it's a sort of a high watermark stage of her life. It's she's taken on new thoughts and the good news that it is for her, and she's in full flow, and people are clearly responding to her message in numbers. She's about to take on, so 1912, it's not long before she takes on the second house in Kensington, and then a little bit later, her grand, huge vision of Coal Dash. But it's before they become a huge burden for her. So it's like this, just a window into her, perhaps at her best, where, the burdens of her past life have been lifted, and before burdens of money, and she's, really struggling with people and doubt comes into the picture about her own abilities as a healer and what her identity is. So I was thrilled. I'm really thrilled to have it. This little glimpse into her, because she was clearly a very private person, and so thank you, Julia. So this couple kept returning, and they went to Cold Ash at the end of the war, and then end of the First War, because Julia was doing something with a sort of a music troupe. She took it to kind of cheer up the troops, the US troops in Europe, but they kind of saw Cold Ash as well. And then they kept coming back. They came here. As I said, they seemed to sort of embrace her change of focus of teaching. When I was in Bloomington, I went to the church that Julia had been a long-time member of. Julia seemed to be someone who could be thoroughly within her church and involved in that community, and also draw on these sort of wider, less mainstream ideas for herself. Carl was always more reserved and so Julia would come for weeks at a time. Carl would come for a bit and then would go on and do other things. So he was always more on the edge himself. But Carl, so after World War I, just to round this bit off, after World War I, Carl resigned his government post in 1919, and in that year, Adela asked him to become a warden of the School of Silence. I guess, she was feeling worn out by then. She was looking for people to take it on. So it might have been, would you come and sort of run Cold Ash for me? Or, it might be, will you be a student and set up your own place somewhere? Anyway, he decided that wasn't his vocation. But they continued this link. And they returned. I mean, the last date that I found in his biography where they came over was 1953. Carl was 80. Julia was in her late 70s, and Adela was 86 by then. So they had a friendship and a connection for over 40 years. And this is them. Not a brilliant copy of a picture, but that's them in later life. And movingly, Adela got rid of a lot of her paperwork, but it's clear that she wasn't well enough to do that towards the end of her life. And there were a number of cheques never cashed. And these two were from Julia and Carl in the late 1950s, 1959, both of those. So they were still wanting to support her, even at that very late stage. So there we are. That's the first offering. So that was 1912. We're now going to move to 1928. So you might remember that Adela has a sister, Clara, living in the States. And I had said that they hadn't been in touch for a long time. I think that was probably the case with Adela, with almost all of her family members. So Dorothy Eves Lull is, so she's this one here on the right. This is Dorothy, and this is Clara's daughter. And she's a teacher. She's married. She's got 2 children, young Dorothy and Mary. And it's Dorothy's grandson, Cabot Sweeney, who I went to stay with as part of my trip. He lives in Kansas. Dorothy came from Birmingham, Alabama, but I didn't go there. I went to Kansas because I'd already made contact with Cabot Sweeney through Ancestry. So they were very gracious. I stayed with them about 5 days. We'd never met before, but he and his wife were lovely and very hospitable. And I went to stay with Cabot, or, well, I certainly wanted to spend time with Cabot because, so he is Clara's great-grandson. And he has become that side of the family's guardian of the family documents and photos. And his aunt had been assiduous in keeping them. And so he's got tons of stuff. And he had shared quite a bit with me already. Oh, and this is a picture of Cabot and me and his wife Betsy, and that's outside their house in Kansas. Yes, so that's Dorothy. 1928 was a significant year for Adela and her sister Clara, because it was the year that they remade contact with one another after what was probably a long, long gap. They hadn't seen each other for years. And possibly the last time that they'd actually been in touch by letter was about 1910, maybe. The time that Adela had her School of Silence, she had sent over a lot of her writings to Clara in response to Clara saying, I'd like to have them. Hadn't ever received a response back from Clara, so thought they weren't of interest. She didn't keep in touch. But Clara broke the silence in 1928. She wrote to Adela. We don't have that letter because Adela, very naughtily, got rid of all her personal letters. But we do have many of Adela's letters because Clara kept them. Anyway, almost certainly the letter that Clara wrote, the thing that inspired getting back in touch was that her daughter Dorothy was coming to England with a group of teachers for, it was something that was happening at Cambridge University, so teaching for teachers from the States. So they were coming over, there were about 28 of them who came over, and she was going to have some free time, and Clara hoped that perhaps she could meet Adela. So as I say, at this point, Dorothy is married. She's early 30s, I think, at this stage, the two daughters. And it's this first letter to Clara after a long, long gap in which she says to Clara that she's got this house on the market. So by 1928, she's moved here. She's invited her nieces from New Zealand. They've come over, they're living with her, or they were living with her on this site, on the field. They were living in a wooden hut, a series of, it wasn't just one hut, it was a series of wooden huts. And she had just had this built the year before, the main house built the year before, for it to be a family home for them, and a housekeeper, and that was going to be Sister Francesca, one of the people remembered in the chapel. The nieces had to break it to Adela that it was too lonely for them living here. They wanted to live in London. The road wasn't tarmacked. It's 2 miles down the road, down a dirt track, even to Burton Bradstock. You know, if ever you were going to meet someone you might want to marry or set yourself up in your own profession, you know, they weren't going to do it here, sadly. She had hoped that they would live a life of self-sufficiency and that would be sufficient. Anyway, she put the house on the market. They were living in London in a flat. She was going to buy herself a little place in Richmond. And she was just waiting because the people I think she might have been going to rent somewhere in Richmond, but the family who were in the house in Richmond had measles, so she couldn't make the move. So to begin with, she was saying, it'd be lovely to see Dorothy, but I might not have anywhere for her to stay. Whilst she's waiting for it to sell, she's had students like Francesca, like the others who've tablets in the chapel and others, who, even though she thought she'd come here to retire, by that time she was teaching again. She had a studio where she taught, and to get herself a bit of income on the house whilst she was waiting for it to sell, she let the rooms in the house to some of the students. And of course we know the sale never took place. And Adela was here in the summer when Dorothy did turn up. So it was Cabot who made this amazing discovery on the last day I was there with them. He was going through heaps of stuff and discovered a little travel journal that he didn't know he had. And it had been written by Dorothy of her time in England. And she wrote about her meeting with her Aunt Adela here. She writes it, so this is a picture of her diary. So Adela has still got this place, but she's not living in it herself. She much prefers living in a hut anyway. That's her house, that's her home of preference, is a hut. So she's living in a hut when Dorothy visits. So again, a bit of deciphering was needed, but you can imagine Cabot and me sitting in their sort of living room. He's told me that he's found it, and we're going through it together, and we're deciphering things together, and we felt like dancing around the room. It was amazing. And the way she writes it, it's not, well, this is what happened to me today. She's writing it as it happens. So that makes it a bit more challenging again to decipher, because it's sort of bits. I can imagine that, she wants to capture things so that she can tell her family back home, but especially her mother, who hasn't seen her sister for 57 years and never will. They never meet, Clara and Adela. So, this is a precious way of taking more back than can be carried in a letter. Or maybe it was almost 50 years that Clara and Adela hadn't met. You remember that beautiful pencil portrait we've got of Adela in the sitting room? Well, that came from Cabot Sweeney 3 years ago. So, one question has been, and you will, I'm not just going off on random on something else. There is a reason for it. The question could be asked, so why is this beautiful pencil drawing of Adela, why was it in the States? Why wasn't it here somewhere? Well, it may be that this journal gives us a possible answer. So she's in London the day before she goes to Dorset. So on Thursday, July the 26th, she has lunch with Mrs. Chancellor. Oh, that's a familiar name, isn't it? Mrs. Chancellor, after the morning where she saw the changing of the guard. And then Grey Buckingham, I can't make out the other word, probably Grey Buckingham Palace. It is a bit boring to look at, isn't it? So she met Mrs. Chancellor after 30 minutes on the tube. She is large, lovely, charming, and then says a bit like someone, mini someone, we don't know who that is. And she says, Mrs. Chancellor, Sherlock Holmes type. Interesting. And I think this is where the portrait comes in. En route to Penn, knew I must see Aunt Adela drawn. Cancelled everything. Rushed. Called Sister Francesca. Went for taxi. Something Globe Hotel. Well, I think it's likely she's referring to this, that at some point, this pencil sketch of Adela has been done, and it's on view somewhere in London, and that she just had to go and see it. And is it possible then that she and her mother bought it and that she took it back to the States? I can't, or they asked for it to be sent, because that sounds plausible to me. So this is the account of how Dorothy described her first ever encounter with Adela. So Dorothy is addressed as Mrs. Lull, just so that you know that. Adela is called Miss Curtis, and Francesca comes in this. She acted as housekeeper to Adela when she first came to Burton. Okay, so Friday, July the 27th, 1928, and this is the page that I transcribed. Train to Bridport, the West Country, downs, hedges, fields like velvet, gold hayricks, Maiden Newton, Bridport at last, found taxi, rode 4 miles, a grey stone house, a bit new, yet grown out of soil. Sister Francesca said, Mrs. Lull, come down to studio. Miss Curtis wishes to see you. No rush. Great eagerness to see her. Walked through garden, locked gates, bare hillside, stone wall, doorway, cobbled path, hut, open doors. Inside, table facing sea, writing things. Opposite wall, fireplace, basket of peat. To left, blue couch, blue pillow, blue hangings, casement cloth. Right, stuffed chair. In silhouette, figure in cream white nun's headdress, flowing robes, white hair, beautiful face, dignity, eyes cornflower blue, kind, shrewd, mystical, humorous, old yet not old, a face one can never forget. She came forward. We shook hands. I knew I should never be afraid. Talked, measuring each other. She probably had quite a reputation in the family, so the will I be afraid of her, perhaps. But when Cabot and I read this together, and we got to we shook hands, he burst out laughing, because as an American, that seems such a typically British, very restrained. Hello, long lost niece I've never met before. But it, you can convey a lot, can't you? So there's a bit more. 4:30, tea at house. Mrs. G, that's possibly Mary Goodwin, Sister Mary, transformed into an angel, white robe, no headdress. Sister Eve, hunchbacked. Sister Antonia, orchid silk, thin face, mystic, not clear like Aunt A's. Back to Aunt A, the sea through the arched stone wall, gulls, swifts, cliffs towards Lyme Regis, rose white, grey. Close clouds, wild swans over Burton Mere, shore, Hussey painting the boat. Hussey was a chap who did a lot of work for the sisters. Night. Aunt A called one Ducky. It's a loveliness in her calling to me, the gallantry of her life. Saturday, July the 28th. Knew I must stay until Monday the 30th. I guess she'd hedged her bets. If she really didn't get on, she could go earlier. She wanted to stay. Walked with Aunt A. Pitt Rivers estate. So it was the Pitt Rivers estate that this field was part of. And somehow Adela Curtis had managed to get a field from Pitt Rivers. View from Knoll Top. So Knoll Top, that's sort of over there. Squares edged with hedges, hawthorns, blackthorns, blackberry. Red and stone house for shepherds against field, and hill and bay, Plymouth and Bill of Portland. Hedge, gorse, bare coast, sea like thousand eyes glistening, sky deep, camp tents, mushrooms on slopes by road. Heavenly crescent of shoreline, Devon coast, sheep and bits of sky dusky. Aunt A very dear. She is lonely, yet in a real sense needs no one. She wanted to go to bed. Sister Francesca warned me. Wonder if I will like Eve and Phyllis, the nieces. Every minute with her. Night after another, tea and dinner. Sea like bleak, hard-hammered metal clouds, close. A friendliness, Sister Eve. The hills, the mist, the rain. Gulls sliding, thatched roof, under hill. By hedge. Chair, sea, beyond flowered edges garden. Hedge, 100 years old. What a place. July the 29th, Sunday. Aunt A, quiet. Sunlight, sea, purple, blue-green, walked to shore, power of waves. Hussey painting the boat, making ready for Miss Eve, that's one of the nieces. Clouds, trailing near cliffs towards Exmouth, rainy. Rain, hedge shelter, looking wet, dry up in Aunt A's hut. Noon, join class, understanding prayer for day, belief in providence. Passed up tea, sat till dusk. 10:40, alone on road and studio. Gap in hedge, more clouds, swirl of green hedge, roll of field, gulls crying, sound of sea. Gulls like cry of a soul. July the 30th, Monday. Morning tea. Rushed up to Aunt A's hut. Talking of Aunt E. Not sure who that is, but maybe Emma Eliza. Whoever, I understand much. Grey sky now, mist, sun in hole tends towards Lyme Regis. Sea like hidden armies, marching, drumming. Hussey had seen to taxi. Bow legs, red jersey. Carnation for Aunt A. Gooseberries. Loves the ground she tends. I'm coming back some day. Must send gift to Hussey. Last talk. Less what we do talk about. Obedience from children. Honour, understanding. You cannot give what you have not. Honour, obey God. Children will honour, obey. Taxi and train. Reached London. Cab to Eve Hutchinson's studio. I think she means Phil. Phil was the artist. She was on the sidewalk waiting. Stairs, flat, pictures. I like them, but they're in the rough. Lunch, chat. Eve put me on bus for Tooting. So at Tooting, Edith and Percy and cousin Bertie live. And this is me talking now, just to let you know, Edith and Percy and cousin Bertie were important members of the family for the Curtises, because Edith was related to one of William Curtis's brothers. They'd all been in Southampton. they had moved to London, and it was with them, and cousin Bertie is their daughter, it was with them that Harriet, Adela's mother, spent the last years of her life. So they took her in and looked after her to her death. So they're important family members that she wanted to see. So Eve put me on bus for Tooting, and it's Tooting where they live. Edith and Percy, cousin Bertie, so good, solid. Homesick for Aunt A and the sea. July the 31st, Tuesday, late breakfast, no mail. Eve and Phil, Kew Gardens, lunch, walk Queen's Cottage, the pagoda, Thames, tea, no black cat, don't know what that means, cherry jam, bought a tube ticket to Tooting. And then Wednesday, August the 1st, Wednesday, left Bertie, cousin Percy went to Liverpool Street Station. They are so kind, must send something. Enjoyed the underground. Just country now, cows, houses. And then she's into her experience of Cambridge. So a whistle-stop encounter, but both Adela and Dorothy write letters to Clara about the visit. So I thought I'd read those. So Adela writes this letter on the day that Dorothy left Dorset, Monday the 30th of July. My dear Clara, Dorothy has just left after staying 3 nights, which was all she could spare, as her time is short. We have become real friends and feel entirely at home with each other. She is a dear soul, so warm-hearted and open and natural and intelligent and friendly and considerate and charming. But Mrs. Chancellor and I were surprised that you should send such a libellous photo of her. Not that one, I'm sure. As Mrs. Chancellor said, how could her mother introduce such a pretty and most attractive creature in every way by such a libel? It was clearly a terrible photo. That photo is only fit to be burnt, for it gives an utterly wrong impression of her. I'm delighted to have met her and hope she will soon bring her husband and children over for a long stay. From her account of you, you seem to be the same as ever. I laughed to recognise the same old traits I remember as a child in you. I hope you got the 2 sets of books safely, one for Alfred. I'll talk about Alfred in a bit. I am teaching every day. Dorothy came to the classes and was interested. You should try and come over sometime. I hear you're still busy at music and working as usual. Dorothy will tell you exactly how I live and the only things I think worthwhile. I hope to hear from her sometimes now we have met and find we belong. With love and blessings, A. And then Dorothy scribbles a letter to her mother on the Wednesday. So that's the day that she travels up to Cambridge. She doesn't say a lot about Aunt A, but I'm going to read it. Dearest mother, had a delightful visit with Bertie Martin. So those are the cousins who looked after Harriet. Percy saw me on this train. Will arrive in Cambridge in a few minutes. Spent yesterday at Kew Gardens with Phil and Eve, Aunt A's nieces, Mabel's girls. I like them. We'll go back to London Monday. Took a nice room where Mrs. Chancellor directed me. In that way, I'll be independent. It's very simple to get about. People are most kind. Sorry my letters are so sketchy. There is just no time. We'll do better in Cambridge. Was so pleased to get your letter at Burton in care of Aunt A. It's a comfort to know all goes well. I'd love to live over here half the time. I'd love to live over here half the time anyway. I do so like it. Hug the children and Cabot, that's the children's father. I want to come home. but I do hate to leave all this. There never was such a country. Heaps of love, Dorothy. P.S. Aunt Adela is the most unusual, lovable, exquisite person I ever met. How much I care for her, though I don't entirely understand her. Somehow, you don't feel you must understand her to love her. So, and there they are. So, clearly Dorothy hoped to return someday. I'm sorry to have to say that she never did. Sadly, only 6 years later, she died of breast cancer. So leaving two youngish daughters and a husband, and of course her mother, Clara, who I think probably never got over the loss. She'd already lost her youngest son, who fought in the First War. Although he was American, he wanted to fight, so he went to Canada to sign up. And then sadly she was left with her one remaining son, Basil, and he had big problems with alcohol. So he couldn't really look after his mother. So Clara's last few years were quite a struggle. So a sad ending, but a lovely record of an encounter between the aunt and niece.